Three men followed a woman in a wheelchair into a dead-end alley in the pouring rain. They thought that they'd chosen the easiest target in Portland. They were wrong. What they didn't see, what nobody ever sees, was the man on the bench across the street. Quiet still, watching with the kind of eyes that don't miss anything. The 90-pound German Shepherd that hadn't moved a muscle. Not yet. Before this story goes any further, if you've never been here before, hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Like this video, stay until the end, because what happens in that alley is only the beginning. The rain came sideways that night. Not the soft Pacific Northwest drizzle that tourists romanticize, the real kind. The kind that finds the gap between your collar and your neck, that soaks through a jacket in 4 minutes flat and makes the whole city smell like wet concrete and fumes and something older, darker underneath. Kind of rain that empties sidewalks and turns street lamps into blurred halos and makes people walk faster, with their heads down, not looking at each other, not looking at anything. Which meant almost nobody noticed Ethan Cross. That was, more often than not, exactly the point. He sat on a wooden bench outside Carver's Coffee on S.W. Morrison, the kind of place that closed at 8 and left one weak amber light burning in the window overnight like a courtesy, or maybe just because someone forgot to flip the switch. The metal chair legs had left rust marks on the concrete from years of rain. Ethan had his elbows on his knees, a paper cup of gas station coffee cooling between both hands, and his eyes on the street, across from him, not staring, obviously watching, just present, settled. The way a man looks when he's been trained to see everything, while appearing to look at nothing. Ranger lay under the bench. The German Shepherd was 11 years old, 73 pounds of retired military working dog, and he had the gray muzzle and the bad left hip to prove it. Most people who saw him assumed he was older than he was. Most people who saw him assumed a lot of things. Right now he had his chin resting on his front paws and his eyes half closed, and he looked for all the world like a very large, very wet, very tired dog doing absolutely nothing. His ears were moving though, cataloging, sorting. Car horn 2 blocks east, a bottle breaking somewhere behind the CVS on the corner. The distant rhythm of a bass line from a bar Ethan couldn't see. A woman's heels on wet pavement, rain on metal fire escapes. The low diesel mutter of a delivery truck, idling somewhere near the loading docks behind the warehouse district. Ranger's ears had logged all of it and dismissed all of it. Then, at 9:47 exactly, they snapped forward. Ethan felt it before he consciously registered what it was, the change in the dog's posture, subtle as a caught breath. Just the slight forward shift of his weight and the almost imperceptible lift of his chin. Anyone else would have missed it. Ethan had been reading Ranger for 6 years. He put down his coffee cup. He looked up. Across Marston some street, under a shredded canvas awning that was doing almost nothing against the rain, a woman in a power wheelchair was struggling. With the chair itself, she moved it, with the practiced ease of someone who'd been doing it for years, but with the 3 men behind her. They were maybe 30 feet back, walking in that particular way that looked casual unless you knew what you were looking for. The way men walk when they're not in a hurry, because they don't need to be. When they know where you're going, even before you do. Ethan knew that walk. He'd used it himself, once, a long time ago. In places that didn't exist on maps that civilians ever saw. The woman, he couldn't see her face clearly from this distance in the rain. Just the shape of her. Dark jacket, yes, leather bag across her lap. Wet hair plastered flat, pushed harder. She hit a crack in the sidewalk, and the chair lurched. Ethan watched her correct it, without hesitating. Muscle memory. Someone who'd learned not to panic at small obstacles. She glanced back. The 3 men didn't speed up. They didn't need to. She turned left at the corner, into the narrow service alley that ran behind the row of warehouses on 3rd Avenue. Ethan knew that alley. Yes, he'd intervened. He'd walked this neighborhood on security patrol enough nights to know it dead-ended against a chain-link fence backed by a concrete retaining wall. There was no through route, no exit. The alley was a box. She didn't know that. Or maybe she did, and she was desperate enough to try it anyway. Either way, Ethan looked down at Ranger. The dog was already on his feet. Easy, Ethan said quietly. Not a command, just an acknowledgement I see it too. He reached down and unclipped the leash. Then he stood up, left the coffee cup on the bench, and crossed the street at a walk. Running. Running attracts attention, changes the acoustics, gives away positioning. He moved along the sidewalk toward the alley entrance with his hands loose at his sides and his breathing already slowing into the pattern his instructors at Bud SH had drilled into him until it was. Autonomic 4 counts in, hold 2 4 counts out. The pre-op rhythm, the one his body knew meant something real, was about to happen. Ranger moved silently beside him, slightly behind his left shoulder. Let me tell you something about Ethan Cross that the 3 men in that alley were about to learn the hard way. He was 36 years old, 5'11", 185 pounds. He had a jaw that looked like it had been hit before, and a nose that proved it. His hands were scarred in ways that people in coffee shops occasionally glanced at and then looked quickly away from. He wore a dark Carhartt jacket that cost $40 at a secondhand store in Gresham, and he drove a 2009 Ford F-150 with 187,000 miles on it and a car seat in the back. He worked private security contracts, weekend shifts at a concert venue, sometimes overnight at a hospital parking structure. Steady, honest, unglamorous work that kept the lights on in the house he rented on the east side and put food on the table and covered Lily's after-school art program. On the surface, he was exactly what he looked like. Tired single father doing what he needed to do. But underneath that surface, underneath the secondhand jacket and the gas station coffee and the quiet bench outside the closed coffee shop was something that the United States government had spent. 4 years and an enormous amount of money building. Ethan had run direct action missions out of SEAL Team 3's Task Unit Bruiser in Ramadi. He'd done close quarters battle clearance in buildings, where the rooms were smaller than some people's bathroom closets and every shadow might be someone's last decision. He'd been part of reconnaissance operations in 3 countries most Americans had never heard of and couldn't have found on a map. He'd carried casualties out of kill zones on his back. He'd made calls in the field that no 28-year-old man should ever have to make, and he'd made them right, and it had cost him something he wasn't sure he'd ever fully gotten back. He'd left the teams when Lily was 3 years old, and her mother was gone, and there was no one else. He didn't regret it. Not exactly. But there were nights like this one, wet and dark and buzzing with that particular electricity that preceded violence, when something in him clicked on that he couldn't click off, and the tired singles father became something else entirely. He didn't have a word for what it was. He just knew when it happened. The alley smelled like standing water and rust and something chemical from the warehouse loading dock. A single light fixture mounted above a fire door about 40 feet in provided the only illumination, a sickly orange that buzzed and flickered and didn't reach the far end of the space. Ethan came around the corner and stopped just inside the entrance. The scene ahead of him was exactly what he'd expected, which didn't make it easier to see. The woman's wheelchair had stopped about 15 feet from the dead-end fence. She'd found it the chain link, the concrete wall beyond it, the total absence of any way out. She'd turned the chair around to face them, which told him something about her. People cornered, keep trying to find an exit that isn't there. She'd stopped, turned around, faced it. The 3 men had spread into a loose arc in front of her. Professionals, their spacing was sloppy, too close together on the left side. One of them kept glancing back at the alley entrance, which meant he was already thinking about what happened if someone came. But they were big. The one in the center, heavyset, mid-30s, wearing a gray hooded sweatshirt dark with rain, had a steel baton extended in his right hand. 40-inch, looks like it's. Ethan cataloged the tactical part of his brain, taking inventory without being asked to. Extendable. He knows how to hold it, so he's used it before. The one on the right had both hands on the handles of the wheelchair, controlling it. The third, youngest, was crouched slightly, going through the leather bag in the woman's lap while she tried to pull it back. She started. Hey, the one with the baton put the tip of it under her chin. Lightly, just a touch, a demonstration. You want to not do that. She went still. There you go, he said, almost pleasantly. Smart girl. Ethan took all of this in during the 3 seconds he stood at the alley entrance. Then he walked forward, keeping his footsteps quiet, on the broken pavement not silent. Would have required different shoes, measured, controlled, that the sound of rain covered them. Stopped about 12 feet behind the group. Let her go. His voice was level, not loud. He didn't need loud, the alley was contained. His voice carried to exactly where it needed to. 2 words had no particular edge to them. They were just words stated plainly, the way you'd say pass the salt or watch your step. All 3 men turned. The one with the baton looked him over. Took his time with it. The second-hand jacket. The ordinary jeans. The dog beside him. The face of a man who looked like he might work at a hardware store. You lost, man? No. Then you need to turn around and walk back the way you came. He half raised the baton. Before you make tonight more complicated than it needs to be. The youngest one, the one who'd been going through the bag, let out a short laugh. One dude, one old dog. He's serious right now? The woman in the wheelchair said nothing. Ethan glanced at her once. Quickly, dark eyes, steady, terrified, but controlled, holding on to some internal spine that was keeping her from completely unraveling. She was looking at him with an expression he recognized. Relief, no hope, just the careful, calculating look of someone assessing whether this development was an improvement or just a different kind of problem. He looked back at the 3 men. Last time, he said. Let her go. The baton man took a step forward. You don't want to. Ethan looked down at Ranger Fass. The German shepherd did not bark. He did not growl or make any sound at all. He simply moved. 73 pounds of trained military working dog crossed 15 feet of wet alley in approximately 1.2 seconds. And the first thing the man on the right knew about it was when 90-degree grip pressure closed around his right forearm with enough force to grind against bone. And then the follow-through momentum dropped him sideways into a tower of metal trash cans that went over like a car crash. The baton man spun toward the dog instinct, the wrong instinct. His attention pulled left and Ethan was already moving. Closed the distance while Ranger was still in the air. Came in at an angle to the baton man's right side, inside the swing radius, which made the weapon almost useless. The man still tried, threw a backhand that connected with nothing but jacket fabric and cold air, and Ethan trapped the baton arm at the elbow with his left hand, applied rotational pressure in exactly the wrong direction for the joint. As the man bent involuntarily forward, he put him down with his right palm to the back of the skull. Brutal, controlled, enough to take the fight out of him without ending his night in a hospital. The man hit the pavement hard. 4 seconds, 2 down. The third one, the youngest, had backed up against the chain-link fence. He was breathing fast, staring at the man, on the ground, staring at Ranger, who had released the first man and was now standing between him and the woman's wheelchair, with his hackles raised and every muscle in his body coiled and absolutely silent. The young man looked at Ethan. What the... He scrambled along the fence, looking for an angle. What is wrong with you, man? You crazy? Just tired, Ethan said honestly. He watched the young man process the situation, batten man down. His companion from the trash cans now sitting against the wall, cradling his forearm and making a sound that was almost crying, the dog between him and any exit that went past the woman. The math was not favorable. The young man clearly recognized this. He flattened himself against the fence and showed his hands. I'm good, he said. I'm good, okay? I'm done. 8 seconds. Ethan had clocked it. From the moment he gave the command to the moment all 3 men were out of the fight. 8 seconds. He exhaled slowly and turned to the woman. She was watching him with that same careful, calculating expression. Are you hurt? He asked. Her voice was steadier than he expected. You have a very well-trained dog. Yeah. He looked at Ranger, who had not moved from his position. is what he's doing. I'm Claire, she said. Claire Bennett. Ethan. A beat. She glanced at the men on the ground, then back at him. You what are you? Police? Military? Was. She nodded, like that explained something she'd already suspected. They weren't random, she said. Her voice dropped. They were looking for this. She pressed both hands flat against the leather bag in her lap. There's a drive in here. Encrypted. If they'd gotten it. Hold on, she stopped. Ethan had heard something. Couldn't have explained it precisely. That particular sensory process. The thing that happened when threat input arrived below the threshold of conscious recognition and went directly to a part of the brain that the civilian mind never gets trained to listen to. You developed it over thousands of hours in the field. Or you didn't, and if you didn't, you often didn't get the opportunity to develop it later. What Ethan heard was an engine, low-displacement diesel, idling. Pulled close, too close, and then the engine cut. What he noticed was the youngest man against the fence had heard it too. And something in his face had changed, a very small, very specific change, the way a person's expression moves when they receive news they have been waiting for. Get down, Ethan said to Claire. What? Down, chair as low as it goes. She dropped the chair's back tilt without question. Headlights, absolute white, the kind of industrial-grade lighting that turns a nighttime space into a crime scene. Photograph it came flooding around the corner of the alley and hit everything at once. The broken pavement, the trash cans, Ranger's eyes catching the light and going green-gold, the men on the ground, squinting and turning away, Claire flat in her chair, Ethan frozen for one single second with his right hand moving toward a position on his hip, where in another life something would have been holstered. A black SUV sat at the alley entrance, a Chevy Suburban. Black plates. The doors opened. 4 men got out, not the soft bodies of opportunists. These were different. The way they moved out of the vehicle said everything. Clean tactical spacing, automatic adjustment to the terrain. The front 2 sweeping angles before they'd fully cleared the doors. These were people who had trained for the specific business of entering a confined space and controlling it. Ethan counted 4 men, 2 with sidearms visible, with something longer under a jacket that was too short to properly conceal it. One hanging at the vehicle who hadn't moved yet, which meant he was either Overwatch or he was the one who got on the radio. There's a 5th, Ethan's brain said immediately. Somewhere with comms. This was coordinated. The man at the front of the 4 raised his hand. A weapon. Just a hand, palm out, like he was stopping traffic. Like this was all very reasonable. Mr. Cross, he said. Ethan went very still. You've had yourself an exciting night. But that bag doesn't belong to the woman. And we'd really appreciate it if everyone went home before it became something it doesn't need to be. Pleasant voice. The kind of pleasant that's been practiced until it sounds effortless. Ethan said nothing. The drive, the man said. Give us the drive and we all walk away. Simple. Claire's voice came from behind him. Very quiet. Very controlled. Don't. The baton man on the pavement was picking himself up now. He wasn't looking at Ethan. He was looking at the men from the SUV. And he was scared of them in a different way than he'd been scared of Ethan, the way a subcontractor is scared of the client. The way someone who was given a job is scared of the people who gave it. That's how they found me, Claire said, just loud enough for Ethan. They had someone following me. These 3 were just supposed to get the bag. They were the SUV. That was supposed to come after. The man in front took 1 step forward. Behind him, the other 3 fanned slightly. Mr. Cross, he said again. Pleasantly. Don't complicate this. Ethan looked at the 4 armed men blocking the only exit from the alley. He looked at Claire, flat in her chair, both hands still pressed against the leather bag like she'd decided a long time ago. She wasn't letting go of it no matter what happened. He looked at Ranger, who had turned to face the new threat and was standing so perfectly still he might have been carved out of the wet, dark air. Ethan took 1 breath in. 4 counts. Okay, he said. The man in front almost smiled. Good. The bag, I said, okay, Ethan said. I wasn't asking you. He looked down at Ranger. The dog looked back up at him. In the fraction of a second, before everything went sideways again, the man from the SUV finally understood too late, by exactly one moment, that the tired-looking man in the second-hand jacket had not been agreeing. He'd been counting. He moved left, right, backward, and toward them left, which was the one direction the four men hadn't fully covered, because the leftmost operative was still finishing his sweep of the alley's near wall, and had left a half-second gap in his sightline. Ethan had seen it the moment they fanned out. He'd been counting it down. He grabbed Claire's wheelchair by the push handles and drove it hard into the recessed doorway of the warehouse's fire exit, a shallow alcove, maybe 18 inches of brick depth, much but enough to break their direct line of sight some from the SUV. The chair's left footrest scraped concrete, and Claire's head snapped back, but she didn't make a snen sound, didn't grab for him, just gripped the bag tighter and tucked her chin. Ranger moved with them without being told. He pressed flat against the brick wall to Claire's left, low, ears back, watching the four men adjust their formation. Pleasant Man raised his hand again. That was unnecessary, he said. Probably, Ethan agreed. He was breathing measured, and even shoulders slightly rolled forward, eyes running a continuous circuit. The four men, yes, the SUV idling at the entrance, the youngest of the original three still against the fence, the baton man who'd gotten to his feet and was now standing with his hands at his sides, doing a very careful impression of someone who was not involved in anything. The man with the long weapon under the short jacket hadn't moved. He was standing slightly behind the lead man and to the right, which was the shooter's position, which told Ethan, which was the shooter's position. Was some not the Mutziad was not the main event. It was theater, buying time. Time for what, exactly, was the question. Here's what I know, the lead man said. He had the measured cadence of someone who'd practiced patience professionally. Ethan Cross, former SEAL. 3, Task Unit Bruiser, 2 deployments to Ramadi, 1 to the Horn. Medical separation in 2019, not physical, which is interesting. He paused. You've got a daughter, Lily, 9 years old. She takes art class on Tuesdays at the Eastside Community Center. The air temperature in the alley didn't change. It just felt like it did. Ethan said nothing. We're not here for a fight, the man continued. We're not here for you. We're here for what's in that bag, and then we're done, and everyone's life goes back to normal. Your daughter's included. Claire's hand found Ethan's wrist in the dark of the alcove. Grabbing, just touching, acknowledging. Ethan looked at the man for a long moment. What's your name? He asked. That's not relevant. Humor me. Garrett, the man said after a pause that suggested it wasn't his real name. Call me Garrett. Garrett, Ethan nodded slowly. You just mentioned my daughter. I mentioned that she exists. I'm not threatening anyone. I'm clarifying the scope of consequences. That's one way to say it. It's the accurate way. Ethan felt something move through him that he didn't let reach his face. It wasn't fear exactly. It was closer to the feeling he'd had in a crumbling building in Ramadi in 2007 when the building's owner had Haveri, that the structure was mind cunnet, not a threat, just a clarification of conditions. A cold, very focused feeling of a man who's realized that the situation is more serious than the surface indicated, and that the next decisions matter more than the ones before them. He thought about Lily, just for a second, the way she smelled like shampoo and marker ink, the way Ranger curled around her at night when the storms were bad, and she thought no one was watching. Put it in a box. Close the lid. The drive, Garrett said. What's on it? Ethan asked. That's also not relevant. It is to me. You've got 4 armed guys and an SUV in a Portland alley at 10 o'clock at night. That's a lot of overhead for petty fraud. Something moved behind Garrett's eyes. A very small recalibration. Give us the drive, he said. Last time I'm going to say it pleasantly. Claire spoke from the alcove. Her voice came out steady and dry and with an edge that surprised Ethan. You were never going to be pleasant. Nope. You were going to kill me the moment I handed it to you, and now you're going to have to decide whether to do it with a witness. Garrett looked at her for the first time since the conversation started. Re-looked at her, the way people do when something they'd filed away as an obstacle suddenly resolve into a variable they hadn't accounted for. Dr. Bennett, he said. I'm not a doctor, she said flatly. I have a master's. Don't flatter me, Ms. Bennett. Buddy needs to die tonight. 3 months ago, a man named David Reyes worked in supply chain compliance for a regional shipping company. He found something he shouldn't have. He told 2 people about it, and then he drove off the Burnside Bridge. Her voice stayed even. The investigation ruled it a suicide. I don't think it was a suicide. The alley was quiet except for the rain. That has nothing to do with. It has everything to do with it, she said. David was the one who first flagged the discrepancy in the North Star manifests. I picked it up after him, and I've spent 93 days connecting every thread he found plus 30 more he didn't get to. That drive has container numbers, payment routing, names of port authority contacts who got paid to look away, and 4 years of shipping records that someone has been very carefully scrubbing from the public database. She paused. And it's encrypted with a key that only 2 people have. I'm one of them. You can take the drive all you want. Without the key, it's 140 gigabytes of noise. Garrett was quiet. The man with the long weapon shifted. Garrett raised one finger at him without looking, and the man stilled. Ethan filed that away. Garrett had enough authority to override an armed operative's instinct with a gesture. Was not a contractor. That was someone's actual chain of command. Who has the other key? Garrett asked. That's my business. Make it mine. Rain moved through the Alice in a gust that rattled the fire escape ladder overhead. Ethan watched Garrett process his options. It was interesting to watch. The man was disciplined, trained, but there was a layer of frustration working through the professional calm now. Claire had introduced a complication. The drive was useless without the key. And the key was locked in a living person's head, which meant the calculus of this operation had just shifted significantly. Couldn't shoot the key out of her. Ethan saw the exact moment Garrett made the decision to shift tactics, because the man's weight transferred slightly forward and the pleasant cadence came back. Here's what I'll offer, Garrett said. Walk away. Both of you, keep the drive. We have no further interest in you once you're out of Portland by morning. Whatever Ms. Bennett thinks she found, let her think it. These things have a way of going nowhere without the right support, and I can assure you the right support is not going to materialize. You're telling me to just disappear, Claire said. I'm telling you to make a smart choice. What happened to David Reyes wasn't a smart choice. It was a threat being delivered. Garrett's jaw tightened by a fraction. Just a fraction. That's a serious accusation. You're standing in a rain-soaked alley with 4 armed men at 10 at night. We're past the part where accusations need to be polite. Ethan almost said something. He decided not to. Claire Bennett was handling this with a sharpness he hadn't expected from someone who'd just been surrounded in a dead-end alley by 3 men with a baton, and the smart move was to let her keep running it. He was watching Garrett, and Garrett was watching Claire. Underneath the negotiation, Ethan was running numbers. 4 armed men plus the one on radio. Someone had relayed his name and Lily's school. That wasn't field intelligence. That was a prepared package, meant at minimum 5 and likely 6. The SUV was still running, which meant the driver had not gotten out. 6 total at minimum. 2 exits, the alley mouth currently blocked by the SUV, and the chain-link fence at the back, which was 12 feet high and topped with razor wire and backed against a concrete retaining wall that dropped 8 feet to the parking structure below. He started thinking about the fence. He didn't want to think about the fence. He was 36 years old, and his right knee had been reconstructed once already. He started thinking about it anyway, quietly, background. It's the way you think about the fire escape when you're sitting in a restaurant and you're not worried, but you always know where it is. I want to believe you, Claire said to Garrett. I genuinely do. But I've been doing forensic accounting for 11 years. I'm very good at following money. And the money I followed led to people that don't take witnesses. He'd intervened. You're not a witness to anything, Garrett said. You're a woman who found some irregular numbers in a shipping database. Found a lot more than that. Show me. She looked at him. Show me what you found, he said. Put the drive in front of us and show me one piece of evidence that justifies this level of risk to yourself. If it's as significant as you believe it is, I'll pull my people back right now, and we'll revisit this through legitimate channels. The offer was smooth. Too smooth. It had the texture of something prepared in advance, a line designed to make a desperate person lean forward. Claire looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at her. He gave a single, very small shake of his head. She looked back at Garrett. No, she said. And Garrett's patience, which had held through the entire conversation with real professionalism, ran out. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't change his expression much. He just tilted his head slightly toward the man with the long weapon and said, very quietly, "Take the bag." Things happened quickly after that. The man with the long weapon moved forward, pulling the jacket aside, and Ethan was already stepping out of the alcove with his hands open, putting himself between the operative and Claire's chair. The man stopped. They were close enough that Ethan could see the faded scar below his left eye, and the way he was breathing, controlled, professional press, but faster than baseline. Was running on adrenaline underneath the training. That mattered. It made him faster, but it also made him slightly less precise. You need to step aside, the man said. I need you to think about what you're doing, Ethan said. I am thinking about it. Think harder. Behind him, Ethan heard Claire's wheelchair motor engage. She was backing along the wall, slowly, panicking. Yes, moving herself without being told. The other three operatives had spread. One to Ethan's left, wide. One staying close to Garrett. The fourth had gone to the right and was coming around the far side to angle on Claire. Textbook two-point squeeze pushed the primary target toward the secondary element. Except Ethan had positioned himself 10 feet from the fire escape ladder that ran up the alley's east wall. He noted it when he came in. 9 rungs to the first landing. Old cast iron. The ladder's bottom rung was pulled up and locked. They all were in this neighborhood. Property owners didn't want access from the street, but the bracket mounting was loose. He'd seen it when Garrett's headlights flooded the space. The left bracket had pulled half an inch from the brick. He had a rough plan. It was not a good plan. It was the plan that existed. Ranger, he said quietly. The dog from the alcove raised his head. Pass up. Watch her. Ranger moved to Claire's side and pressed himself against the wheel of her chair. He would not move from that position now, regardless of what happened to Ethan. Was what the command meant. That was what Ranger had been trained to do once upon a time in exercises that were a great deal more theoretical than this moment. The man with the long weapon took another step. Ethan let him take it. He let him close the distance to 6 feet, which put him at a range where the weapon was actually a disadvantage, too close to aim, too long to maneuver, and then he did something the man clearly didn't expect, because almost nobody ever does. He stepped into him instead of back. Into the weapon, yet into the space, closing the last 6 feet in a single movement that took the gun barrel across his left forearm as it came up. Painful. He felt the impact all the way to the shoulder. The barrel was offline now, and the man's grip broke at the right wrist from the rotation, and Ethan put through it, and then they were tangled and close, and Ethan drove his forehead into the man's nose. The operative went down. The one on the left was already coming. Ethan pivoted off the downed man, took 2 running steps toward the fire escape wall, and jumped. His hands caught the bottom rung. It dropped 6 inches with a grinding shriek of protesting metal, and then held, and he pulled himself up in one movement and got his feet on the first rung before the operative below grabbed for his leg. Fingers grazed his boot heel. He climbed. The second landing was 8 feet above the first. He cleared the first landing in 4 rungs and swung himself onto the grating. And for a moment the entire structure shuddered and the loose left bracket tore completely free of the brick, and the section of railing he was holding flexed outward at an angle that turned his stomach cold. Below him, The situation had reorganized. The operative he'd headbutted was on one knee, not out, pressing his forearm against his face. The one who'd grabbed for his leg was at the base of the ladder, calculating whether to follow. Garrett had not moved from his position near the SUV entrance, was watching with the expression of someone who had just received information that updates a previous assessment. The fourth operative, the one who'd gone right to get around Claire, had stopped. Because Ranger was between him and the wheelchair, and the dog was still and silent, and absolutely... And the man had apparently decided that whatever he was being paid was not calibrated for a dog this committed. "You're on a fire escape," Garrett said, looking up at Ethan. His voice was still level. "You're on a fire escape in the rain, and you have a blown-out knee and a 9-year-old at home." "Whose home are we talking about?" Ethan said. "I told you. One's threatening. You mentioned Lily's school. By name, by schedule." Ethan's voice was even, and the words came out with no particular force, but they landed cleanly in the contained space of the alley. "That's not a threat, fine. Then it's information. And I need you to understand something about what you've done by sharing that information with me tonight." Garrett waited. "You've changed my math," Ethan said. The rain hammered the fire escape grating. Water ran through the gaps and fell to the alley below in thin silver lines. "You're one man," Garrett said. "Yeah," Ethan said. "I am." He looked down at Claire. She was looking up at him with an expression that had moved past fear into something more complicated, not trust exactly, not yet, but a version of it that was forming in real time under very unfavorable conditions. She had both hands flat against the bag. "The drive," he said to her. "Is it physically the only copy?" "No," she said. "But the others are—" She hesitated. "Accessible, if you know where to look." He nodded. "Process that. Who else knows about what you found?" "One person," she said. "Someone I trust. Where are they now?" "Safe. For now." Garrett looked between them, and Ethan could see the man recalculating again. It was becoming a pattern in this conversation. Claire introducing complications. Garrett processing them. The professional patience getting thinner each time. "This doesn't have to end badly," Garrett said, for the third time. "Call your people back," Ethan said. "Right now. All of them. Pull the SUV." "I can't do that." "You mean you won't?" Garrett didn't answer. Ethan climbed another rung up, and from this height he could see over the alley wall to the street beyond Morrison, 2 blocks east, and what he saw made him go very still. A second vehicle. Another SUV, dark, parked at the far corner with its lights off. 2 shapes inside. He'd been right. 6 total was a conservative count. Were at least 8. It's at the street, yet the steep, and he looked at the alley, and he did the math on all of it. 8 armed men, 2 exits, a woman in a wheelchair, a dog, a fire escape with a broken bracket, backup, and for a moment, just one moment, he allowed himself to feel exactly how bad this was. Then he put that in the box too. His knee throbbed from the ladder climb. The arm where the gun barrel had crossed it was going to be ugly by morning. The grating under his feet was slick with rain, and loose section of railing was moving with each gust in a way that made him not want to look at the bracket. He reached into his jacket pocket. Garrett's eyes tracked the movement. "Easy," one of the operatives said. Ethan pulled out his phone, kept his eyes on Garrett while he unlocked the screen with his thumb and pressed a contact he hadn't called in 14 months. It rang twice, 3 times. He thought, for a terrible second, that it wouldn't connect. Call went through, and a voice he recognized said, "Cross." "Time it is?" "Nolan," Ethan said. "I need 60 seconds. Pause. Background noise in office, or something like it. Late night. Keyboards and low conversation." "Talk," said Special Agent Nolan Pierce. Ethan looked down at Garrett. Garrett was looking up at him, and the man's expression for the first time since he'd stepped out of the SUV had shifted. Much. Not obviously. But something behind the professional calm had moved, the way ice moves when the temperature changes, not dramatic, just a subtle settling, a faint acknowledgement that the ground was less solid than it had been. He recognized the name. That was what it meant. Whatever briefing package his people had put together on Ethan Cross, the second-hand jacket, the security job, the 9-year-old, the blown-out knee, it had apparently not included the fact that Ethan Cross had spent 3 years embedded on joint task force operations with a particular division of federal investigators before he'd mustered out. That he'd run joint targeting packets with Pierce's team in 2 theaters. That Pierce now ran a 12-person federal organized crime unit out of the Portland field office and had, on 3 separate occasions since Ethan's discharge, told him that if he ever needed anything to call the damn number. Ethan had never called it, until now. Portland, he said into the phone. Alley behind the warehouse district on 3rd and Morrison. I've got a federal evidence issue and an armed contractor situation, and I need you to tell me you can have someone here in 10 minutes. Pause. Longer how many? Pierce asked. 8 that I've confirmed. Possibly more. Armed? Yes. You in a position? A great one. Sit tight. The line went quiet but didn't disconnect. Ethan lowered the phone. He looked at Garrett. Garrett looked at him. Between them, the rain fell steady and cold and indifferent, filling the low spots on the alley floor, running along the gutter, carrying the night somewhere else. Federal agent, Ethan said, who I've known for 9 years, who runs the organized crime desk in this city. He tilted his head. You want to revisit the math on whether this ends badly? Garrett was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then he said something Ethan didn't expect. What you're protecting? Tell me. The woman found numbers in a spreadsheet. She doesn't know what those numbers connect to. She thinks she does. He looked at Claire. You think you've mapped the whole thing. You haven't. What you're holding is one corner of something that has been operational for 4 years across 7 states, and the people at the center of it are not the people whose names appear in those manifests. The names in those manifests are, he stopped, recalibrated, spendable. So you're telling me, Claire said from below, that Marcus Vane isn't actually who I should be looking at. The name hit the alley and spread out, and Garrett's face did something that wasn't quite a reaction, but was close enough. Where did you hear that name? He said. Claire's voice was very careful and very deliberate. It's in the manifests, payment routing. His name appears on 7 contracts. She paused. Are you telling me he's not the top of this? Garrett said nothing. Are you telling me the man I've been building a case against for 93 days is someone else's cutout? Still nothing. And in that silence, in the particular texture of Garrett's non-answer, Ethan heard something shift. In the alley, in the scope of what this actually was. Claire had found the corner, like Garrett said, and even the corner was bigger than anyone had realized. From 2 blocks away, faintly but getting less faint, came the sound of sirens. Garrett heard it. His team heard it. The operative still calculating. The fire escape ladder heard it. The one watching Ranger heard it. Garrett took one breath. Let it out. This isn't over, he said. Tonight it is, Ethan said. 3 seconds. 4. The sirens getting cleaner, closer. The familiar rise and fall of federal vehicles rather than city patrol. Pierce had moved fast, faster than Ethan had honestly expected. Garrett turned and walked back to the SUV without another word. His team moved with him, the trained, unhurried retreat of people who've been trained to never look like they're running. The man with the long weapon limped. The one Ranger had held near the trash cans was nursing his forearm against his chest. The Suburban's doors closed. The engine revved. The alley entrance was empty, and the red taillights were gone, and it was just rain, and the flicker of the broken street lamp, and the distant belting wail of sirens, and Claire Bennett sitting in her wheelchair beneath the alcove, both hands still pressed flat against the leather bag on her lap, looking up at Ethan on the fire escape. She exhaled, long and slow and shaky. Ranger walked to her side and put his heavy head in her lap, put one hand on his neck, and held on to him. Ethan climbed down the fire escape 1 rung at a time, favoring his right knee, and when he got to the bottom, he stood on the wet pavement and looked at the alley entrance and the empty street beyond it, and he thought about what Garrett had said. About the corner, about Vane being a cutout, About the fact that Claire had spent 93 days chasing a man who might be someone else's disposable piece on a board whose edges she hadn't found yet. He looked at her. "You said one other person knows," he said. "The one who's safe. Yes, you need to call them right now." She was already reaching for her phone. The first federal vehicle turned onto Morrison Street, its lights throwing red and blue across the wet faces of the buildings. Ethan stood at the mouth of the alley with Ranger and waited, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a very quiet and very familiar voice that sounded a great deal like his old team sergeant in Ramadi was telling him that the thing about a corner was that when you found it, when you finally pulled it back and got a look at what was underneath, you had better be prepared for what you saw there to be much larger and much darker than the corner itself had suggested. He'd found that to be true over the years. He was finding it to be true again. The first federal vehicle hadn't fully stopped before its doors opened. Two agents in dark jackets hit the wet pavement moving fast, hands at hips, scanning the alley entrance before they'd finished clearing the vehicle. A second car came in behind them, angling across the mouth of the alley, and then a third. The red and blue light turned the rain into something that looked almost electric, every drop catching color on the way down. Pierce came out of the second vehicle. He was 51 years old, built like someone who'd been athletic 20 years ago, and had since made peace with the fact that he wasn't anymore. And he had a face that looked like it had been working too hard for too long and had stopped pretending otherwise. He wore a federal windbreaker over a dress shirt that suggested he'd been in the office when the call came. Crossed the alley entrance in 6 strides, took in the scene, the overturned trash cans, the baton man, and the youngest of the original 3 still sitting against the wall looking like they'd decided the safest thing to do was to hold perfectly still, and then found Ethan standing near the fire escape with Ranger at his heel and Claire Bennett in her chair beside him. Pierce looked at the fire escape, at the broken bracket, at Ethan's arm, where the jacket was torn at the forearm, and there was blood on the sleeve. "You look terrible," Pierce said. 4 months without a gym membership," Ethan said. "What happened to the others?" "They left." "How many?" 8 confirmed. Maybe more. 2 vehicles, 1 SUV at the alley entrance and a second on Morrison 2 blocks east. Pulled out maybe 4 minutes before you got here. Pierce turned to one of his agents. "Get a bolo out on both vehicles." "Dark, suburban, Oregon plates. Did you get the number?" "Partial," Ethan said. 7 Victor 4, I think. "I wasn't in a great position." "Something's better than nothing." Pierce looked at Claire. "Ms. Bennett," she looked up at him. "You know who I am. I know your name from a report that crossed my desk 8 weeks ago. An anonymous tip about irregularities in a commercial shipping database." He paused. "The report was referred to financial crimes. I don't know what happened to it after that." Something in Claire's expression flattened. It was buried. "That's a strong word. It disappeared into a referral queue, and nobody called me back." "I'd say that qualifies." She held up the leather bag. "I have 140 gigabytes of evidence that North Star Freight Systems has been running an illegal secondary operation through its commercial shipping network. Financial fraud is the surface layer. What's underneath it is considerably worse." Pierce looked at Ethan. "She hasn't told me everything yet," Ethan said. "How much do you know?" "Enough to know that the people who sent 8 armed men to collect a hard drive are not the kind of people who send 8 armed men over irregular shipping manifests." Pierce was quiet for a moment. He looked at the alley around them, the rain, the broken light, the marks on the pavement where the confrontation had happened, and he seemed to be running some internal calculation that Ethan recognized as the same one he'd run himself on the fire escape. "Get in the vehicle," Pierce said. The federal field office on S.W. Jefferson was the kind of building that looked from the outside like it could be anything: an insurance company, a regional bank, a law firm that did quiet work for large clients. And inside it was fluorescent lights and institutional carpet and the specific smell of a place where people worked too many hours on things they couldn't talk about at dinner. Pierce put them in a conference room on the 4th floor. Someone brought coffee that was better than the gas station cup Ethan had left on the bench outside Carver's. Ranger settled under the table and didn't move, Momo, though his eyes tracked every person who came through the door. Claire's contact turned out to be a woman named Soren Park, mid-40s, Korean-American. Yes, he'd intervened, who arrived 30 minutes after they did with a laptop bag over one shoulder, and the look of someone who'd been awake for 30 hours and had made peace with 31. She was a data systems architect, she said, which was how she'd helped Claire build the encryption structure on the drive, and why she had the second key. She and Claire went through the drive's contents with Pierce and two of his analysts for the better part of an hour. Ethan sat at the far end of the table, with his coffee and his bad arm and his dog, and did not say much, because he wasn't a forensic accountant and he wasn't a federal agent, and the work happening at the other end of the table was not his work. What he was doing was watching Pierce. The agent's expression changed 4 times during that hour. Ethan counted them. The first shift came about 15 minutes in, when Claire pulled up a series of shipping manifests alongside payment records and showed how the two sets of numbers didn't reconcile, not by accident, by clerical error, by a deliberate parallel accounting structure running underneath Northstar's legitimate operation like a second circulatory system. The second shift came when she showed the Port Authority contacts. The third came when she pulled up the container numbers, specific containers, specific routes, specific dates, running quarterly for 4 years from the Port of Portland through intermediate stops at 3 other Pacific before the final declared destinations. The fourth shift came when she said the containers weren't moving goods. Kind of goods they said they were moving. I don't have direct confirmation of contents. I'm an accountant, not a port inspector. But the payment routing and the security protocols attached to these specific containers don't match anything in Northstar's legitimate cargo profile. And the recipients on the receiving end, she pulled up a set of corporate names, shell structures nested inside each other like a series of progressively smaller boxes. These don't exist as functioning businesses. They exist as endpoints. Accounts that receive funds and then disperse them in a pattern I've seen exactly once before in 11 years of forensic work. Pierce said where? An arms-dealing case out of a federal court in Virginia. 2018. I was brought in as an outside consultant on the financial mapping. She looked at him steadily. Payment pattern was almost identical. The room was quiet. Pierce sat back in his chair. He pressed both hands flat on the table and looked at the screen and said nothing for what felt like a full minute. One of his analysts said quietly, ITAR violations. At minimum. International Traffic in Arms Regulations. The federal framework governing the export of defense articles and military technology. Violation at this scale wasn't a white-collar fraud case. It was a national security matter, which meant it changed everything about who needed to be notified, who had jurisdiction, and how fast things needed to move. Pierce looked at Ethan. You said the man who led the contractor team tonight. Called himself Garrett, Ethan said. Not his name. Operational alias, my read. Description. 5'10", 175 maybe. Early 40s. Dark hair going gray at the temples. Wore it short, military short. Spoke like someone who's run negotiations before, practiced, calm, structured. He knew my name, my service record, Lily's school schedule. Was a prepared package. He didn't pull it from a phone. He already had it. That level of prep on a private individual and under. Pierce checked his watch. Under 4 hours since the initial contact attempt tonight. That's not a private contractor working on short notice. That's an established surveillance operation. Yeah, Ethan said. That's what I thought. They were already watching her, Soren said from across the table. Wasn't a question. For how long? Pierce asked Claire. Her voice was quiet, but not shaking. I felt followed for about 6 weeks. I thought I was being paranoid. You weren't, Pierce said. I know that now. Pierce stood up and walked to the window. Portland at night. 11 p.m. Rain streaking the glass. The city's lights turning the low cloud cover amber. He stood there for a moment with his hands in his jacket pockets. Marcus Vane, he said. His name's on 7 contracts, Claire said. Payment routing goes through 2 of his holding companies. Who Marcus Vane is, Pierce said. He turned around. Civic donor. Sits on 3 nonprofit boards. Donated the wing of a children's hospital that has his name on it. He shook hands with the governor at a fundraiser 8 months ago. He paused. I also know that his name has come across my desk twice in 3 years in contexts that didn't connect to anything I could build a case around. Tonight, the room absorbed that. The man from tonight, Ethan said. Garrett, he said something. Pierce looked at him. He said Claire found a corner. He said the names in the manifests, Vane included, are expendable. Ethan kept his voice flat. He implied there's something above Vane. Something the manifests don't reach. Pierce was very still. He said it like he wanted us to understand the scope. Ethan continued. I don't know whether that was a warning or a manipulation or whether he was telling the truth. He said it like someone who knew it firsthand. He's not working for Vane, Soren said. Meaning whoever he's working for, Vane is a layer of insulation between that person and the operation. Ethan picked up his coffee. Same way you'd build it. You put someone respectable and connected out front. Someone with enough legitimate profile that scrutiny stops at them. Underneath that, you run the actual mechanism. Pierce looked at Claire, the recipients of the final payment routing. After the shell companies. I tracked it as far as I could, she said. Terminates in 4 accounts across 3 jurisdictions. 2 of those accounts have partial transaction histories that I matched to a holding entity registered in Nevada. She pulled up the screen. Redline Meridian LLC, registered 2019. Single managing member listed as a trust instrument, no individual named. Trust instrument was established in 2018 by a law firm in D.C. that specializes in, I know that firm, one of Pierce's analysts said. He'd gone slightly pale. They do asset protection work for, he stopped. Looked at Pierce. Pierce held up one hand. Not in this room. Yet. He looked around the table. What we have here goes upstairs before it goes anywhere else. He looked at Claire. The drive stays with us. Chain of custody starts right now. I need you to walk my team through every step of how you obtained this material, and I need Soren to verify the encryption key procedure so we can document it properly. Claire nodded. Pierce turned to Ethan. You should go home. Cross. Pierce's voice shifted by a degree, not softer exactly, just less official. You did the right thing tonight, calling me. I had limited options. You had the option of walking away from an alley in the rain and not making it your problem. Ethan thought about the 3 men in the loose formation behind a woman in a wheelchair. Practiced non-urgency of their walk. The way they'd spread when she hit the dead end. He said, I didn't. He got home at 12:40 a.m. The house was dark, except for the lamp in Lily's room that she left on, because she'd never fully outgrown being afraid of the dark, though she'd recently decided that admitting this was embarrassing, and so they had tacitly agreed to not discuss it. The lamp leaked a thin strip of light under her door. Ethan stood in the hallway for a moment and listened to the house, the refrigerator hum, the rain still working at the windows, Lily's breathing from behind the door, even and slow. He went to the kitchen and stood at the sink and ran cold water over his forearm, which was bruised in a long diagonal line from the gun barrel and had stopped bleeding but was beginning to stiffen. He pressed a dish towel against it and held it there and stared out the window at the backyard, the window above the sink, the old maple tree that had been there since before they'd moved in. Ranger came and sat beside him and leaned against his leg. Ethan put one hand on the dog's head. Yeah, he said quietly. He didn't sleep much. He lay in the dark and turned the evening over, looking at each piece of it the way you disassemble a mechanism to understand how it works. Garrett knowing Lily's schedule. The 8-man team for a single hard drive. Garrett's face when Claire said Vane's name, not surprise. Exactly, more like confirmation that she'd found the edge she'd been looking for. The analyst in Pierce's conference room going pale at the mention of the D.C. law firm, Redline Meridian LLC. He turned that over too. 3 a.m. his phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text from Pierce. Drive is authenticated. Content verified. Going to DC in the morning. Keep your phone on. He set the phone down. Outside the window, the rain had finally slowed. He could hear the maple tree dripping. The morning came gray and washed clean, the way Portland mornings do after heavy rain. Everything slightly more itself. The colors of the brick buildings on the east side deepened to rust and orange and brown, the air cold and transparent. Ethan walked Lily to her bus stop at 7:15. She was in the phase of her life where she was simultaneously too old to hold his hand and occasionally still grabbed it anyway when she forgot herself. This morning she forgot herself coming around the corner where the puddle was, and she took his hand for half a block, and he didn't say anything about it. "You're tired," she said. "Little bit. Were you working last night?" "For a while, yeah." She was quiet for a moment. She had her mother's dark eyes and the habit of turning observations over before she shared them, which was sometimes unnerving a 9-year-old. "Ranger was weird this morning," she said. "He kept checking the windows. He does that after a long night." "You both do," she said. He looked at her. She shrugged in the way that meant she was done with the subject and also that she was smarter than the subject deserved. The bus came. She got on without looking back, which she'd been doing lately, practicing independence in small visible ways. Ethan watched the bus until it turned the corner. Then he stood there for a moment on the sidewalk, in the thin morning light. His phone rang. "Pierce, you up?" Pierce said. "Yeah." "We've got a problem." Ethan started walking back toward the house. "Tell me." The analyst who recognized the law firm last night, the one who went quiet in the conference room. He made a phone call at 2 a.m. from his personal cell. "To anyone on my team." Pierce's voice was controlled, but underneath the control, there was something that sounded like a man who'd spent the night not sleeping for very different reasons than Ethan. Call was 11 minutes long. "I don't have the content yet." "I'm working on it." "Who'd he call?" "I don't know yet." "The number traces to a VIP relay. It'll take time to unpeel." Ethan stopped walking. "Pierce." "Yeah. Does he know what you have? The full scope of the drive's contents?" "He was in the room for most of the review session." "Whoever he called knows by now." "Yes," Pierce said. "That's the problem." Ethan turned around and looked at his house from the sidewalk. The front door, the lamp in Lily's window, still on in the morning light, amber and small. "Claire and Soren," he said. "I've got 2 agents with them. They stayed at the field office overnight." "Okay," he thought. "What about the drive, the copy?" "Secured. Chain of custody documented. Garrett said the names in the manifests are expendable. If whoever's above Vane knows the drive's content is already in federal hands, they have one play left. Discredit the evidence or discredit the source," Pierce said. "Both. Silence on the line, or both," Pierce agreed. "Which means Claire." "Which means Claire," Pierce said. "And anyone else who can testify to how the evidence was gathered and what it shows." He paused. "Including Soren." Ethan went inside. Ranger was at the door, had been at the door, yes, tail moving once in greeting, and then going still again, watching him. "What do you need from me?" Ethan said. "Nothing. Officially, you're not part of this." "That's not what I asked." Another pause. Pierce was a careful man. He'd gotten where he was by being careful in ways that most people never had to be, by understanding the distance between what a situation required and what the rules permitted and navigating that distance with enough precision to not lose either his effectiveness or his career. "There's a warehouse," Pierce said. "Port District. Container facility. North Star. Leased. I've been trying to get a warrant for it for 6 weeks and every application is stalled in the magistrate queue." "On what's on that drive?" "I'm going to try again with a federal judge I trust." "If I get it, you'll need to move before whoever Garrett is working for moves the containers." "How fast can you get the warrant?" "If the judge signs by noon, we can have a team at the port by 3. "It's 7:30 now," Ethan said. "That's 7.5 hours. Aware of the timeline. What happens in 7.5 hours if the warrant doesn't come through?" Pierce didn't answer that. He didn't need to. Call ended, and Ethan stood in his kitchen and looked at Ranger and thought about the shape of the next 7 hours and what they likely contained. He thought about Garrett pulling out of the alley last night, the trained, unhurried retreat, the controlled discipline of it. And then he thought about what a man like Garrett does when he reports back to whoever he reports to and explains that the evidence is already in federal hands, and there's a federal agent named Pierce who has it. A man like Garrett didn't panic. He didn't run. He pivoted. He identified the weakest point in his opponent's structure, and he applied pressure there. And if the weakest point was a federal analyst who'd made an 11-minute phone call at 2 a.m., then Garrett already knew exactly how much time he had before the warrant came through, and he was already planning how to use it. Ethan made a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table and opened his laptop. He knew how to research. It was one of those skills that translate from the teams to civilian life in ways that most people didn't realize the ability to pull open source information together quickly, to cross-reference, to find the thread in a pile of data and follow it without getting distracted by threads that's adjacent to it. He'd used it on security jobs, background checks, due diligence for clients who needed to know who they were dealing with. He pulled up everything publicly available on North Star Freight Systems. Incorporated 2009, Pacific Northwest Regional Carrier. Annual revenue publicly listed at approximately $340 million. Fleet of commercial trucks and a port lease that gave them access to 3 container berths at the Port of Portland. Board of directors, 6 names. Primary investors, 2 private equity vehicles, both with clean public profiles. Marcus Vane appeared nowhere in the official corporate structure. Was in itself interesting. Claire had found his name on 7 contracts and payment routings. But he wasn't a board member, not a listed officer, not a disclosed investor. He was connected through the financial, but invisible at the structural level, which meant he'd been careful, or someone had been careful on his behalf. Ethan searched Vane directly. Public profile was exactly what Pierce had described: civic donor, hospital wing, 3 nonprofit boards, photos with politicians, a foundation that distributed grants to community organizations across Oregon. A man who'd spent considerable energy over a considerable period of time building a public persona that read as unimpeachable. He found a business profile piece from a local magazine 2 years old. Vane quoted at length about his commitment to Oregon's economic development, his belief in the port as the city's economic spine. His personal history: grew up in Astoria, worked the docks as a young man, his first business from nothing, reinvested in the region that made him. Ethan read the piece twice. Then he found the detail that snagged him. Near the end of the profile, a brief mention of Vane's early career before the civic profile. Before the foundation listed a period of international logistics consulting. The work was described in deliberately vague terms, as these things often were in profile pieces, but a company name appeared: Westbridge International Transit Services. Based in the early 2000s, and Ethan checked it twice, Virginia. He searched Westbridge International. The company had dissolved in 2007. In 2006, one of its subsidiary contracts had been investigated by the Department of Defense for irregular procurement documentation. The investigation had been closed without charges. The D.C. law firm that had represented Westbridge during that investigation was the same firm that had later established the trust instrument for Redline Meridian LLC. Ethan sat back in his chair, the same firm, 15 years apart. He looked at that connection for a long time. Then he took a photograph of his screen and sent it to Pierce with a single line of text: Vane's early career. Virginia firm. Same as Redline. Look at Westbridge International 2006 DoD investigation, closed without charges. The reply came back in under 2 minutes. Where did you find this? Public profile piece. Local magazine. 2 years old. A longer pause. Then, how long have you been awake? Doesn't matter. You have 7 hours. 6 now, Pierce sent back. Be with your kid. She's at school, then sit down. Ethan put the phone on the table and looked at the maple tree through the kitchen window. The rain had completely stopped, and the morning light was coming through the wet leaves and breaking into pieces on the table in front of him. Ranger had his chin on Ethan's foot. His arm hurt. His knee hurt. He was 36 years old, and he'd walked away from the hardest job in the world to make lunches and attend school plays and do the ordinary relentless work of raising a kid alone. And for years, he'd told himself that was enough, was more than enough, was the thing that mattered now. And it was. He meant it. He didn't regret it. But there was a part of him, a part that had been quiet and patient for a long time, that had fully woken up last night in a wet alley at the sound of Ranger's ears coming forward. And that part was now running at a frequency that it hadn't run at in years, processing the problem, mapping the variables, looking for the shape of what was coming. Because Garrett hadn't been finished. Last night was a tactical withdrawal, not a retreat. Was a difference. A retreat meant you'd given up the objective. A withdrawal meant you'd reassessed and were finding a better approach. And the better approach, when a federal drive was already in evidence lockup and a warrant was pending, was not another team of armed men in an alley. The better approach was pressure on the person who gathered the evidence, on their credibility, their methodology, their history, on the people around them, on the weakest points. Ethan had named two of those points last night, Claire and Soren. He was sitting here thinking about whether there was a third. His phone rang again, not Pierce this time, a number he didn't recognize. He looked at it for 2 rings. Then he answered. Mr. Cross, said a voice he didn't know. Not Garrett, older than Garrett. The kind of voice that belonged to someone who'd learned a long time ago that authority was most effective when it sounded relaxed. Think it's time you and I spoke directly. My name is Marcus Vane. Ethan said nothing. I know that's probably not what you were expecting, Vane said. I suspect you're trying to figure out how I got this number, which is fine. Take your time. A brief pause. I got it because I have access to resources that most people don't. Which is, really, what I'd like to talk to you about. I'm listening, Ethan said. His voice came out flat and even. You're a smart man. You connected things last night that most people wouldn't have connected. And you called someone who matters. Another pause. I'd like to offer you the opportunity to make a different call. To understand what you're actually standing in the middle of, before you make decisions you can't reverse. Ranger lifted his head from Ethan's foot. He looked at Ethan with the clear, unambiguous focus of an animal that understood something in the room had shifted, even if it couldn't name the thing. Ahead, Ethan said, and Marcus Vane began to talk. Vane's voice had the texture of expensive furniture, solid, deliberate, chosen. Nothing about it was accidental. Here's what I'd like you to understand, he said. What Ms. Bennett found, the financial architecture she's spent 93 days mapping, is real. I'm not going to insult your intelligence by telling you she got it wrong. Yet, Ethan said nothing. He'd put the phone on the table and switched to speaker and was now standing at the kitchen window with his arms crossed, watching the maple tree, watching the street beyond the fence. The car he didn't recognize was parked 2 houses down. It had been there when he'd walked Lily to the bus. It was still there. What she doesn't understand, Vane continued, is context. I'm sure she doesn't, Ethan said. A brief pause, like Vane was recalibrating for the dryness of that. North Star's secondary operation has been running for 4 years under a framework that was, and I want to be precise here, sanctioned. Publicly. Not through channels that leave a paper trail that a forensic accountant can find. But sanctioned. Sanctioned by who? By people whose names you'd recognize from the news. That's not an answer. It's as specific as I'm going to be on an unsecured line. Ethan looked at the car down the street. It was a gray Honda Accord, older license plate partially obscured by the angle. He memorized the visible characters. You're telling me this is a government program, he said. I'm telling you it operates with awareness at levels that make the word illegal considerably more complicated than Ms. Bennett's case theory assumes. People used to tell me the same thing about rendition sites, Ethan said. Turned out complicated meant wrong. Silence, Mr. Cross, don't, Ethan said. Don't do the next part where you explain to me why this is different. I've heard that sentence in 3 countries. It was never different. Pause. Longer. When Vane spoke again, something in his voice had shifted by a small but measurable degree, the relaxed authority pulling back slightly, the way a tide pulls back before it decides what to do next. "What is it you want?" Vane said. "I want you to understand something," Ethan said. "The drive is in federal custody. The content is documented. Chain of evidence is established. Whatever you or Garrett or whoever Garrett reports to does in the next 6 hours doesn't change that. I know that. Then you know the call you're making right now doesn't have a version where it ends well for you. Unless," Vane said, "the federal agent holding that evidence has a problem that makes him reluctant to move forward." Ethan went still. "Pierce is clean," he said. "Pierce is clean," Vane agreed. "But Pierce operates inside an institution, and institutions have pressure points that individual people don't." He paused. "The analyst on his team, who was in that conference room last night, you know about the call he made. Pierce knows about the call. Pierce knows a call was made. He doesn't know what was said, or who to." A careful pause. "What was said, Mr. Cross, was a request to flag the warrant application, to route it through a different magistrate, one with a broader understanding of national security considerations." Ethan turned away from the window. He picked up the phone and took it off speaker and put it to his ear. "You're going to kill the warrant," he said. "I'm going to complicate it," Vane said. "Which buys time. Time for containers to be inventoried, relabeled, redistributed through legitimate channels. Yes, no. Any federal team reaches those berths, there'll be nothing to find that Claire Bennett's manifests connect to. And she looks like she built a fraud case on phantom evidence. She looks like a very intelligent woman who drew incorrect conclusions from incomplete data, which is not a crime, and which means she goes home, her career takes a hit she can probably recover from. And this," he paused, "this whole thing recedes." Ethan sat down at the kitchen table. His arm hurt, his knee hurt, his brain was running very fast and very cold. "You want me to call Pierce," he said, "and tell him to stand down. I want you to understand that the warrant isn't coming, and that the evidence on that drive, while technically authenticated, is going to become the subject of a classification review that buries it for anywhere between 8 months and 2 years. Vane's voice was measured. "By which point, Ms. Bennett will have moved on. Her source material will have been superseded by operational changes, and the matter will be closed." "And David Reyes," Ethan said. The name landed. Vane was quiet for 2 full seconds. "It had nothing to do with. A man is dead," Ethan said. "He found what Claire found, and he's dead. I don't know anything about—" "Stop." The word came out with a flatness that cut the sentence in half. "You called me because you think I'm the soft point. Single father, security job, nothing to gain from making this harder. You think I'm the variable you can move." He looked at Ranger. The dog was watching him without blinking. "I want you to hear me very carefully. You mentioned my daughter's school last night, through Garrett. And now you're on my phone, and you've told me you can bury the warrant and erase the evidence and make all of this goes away. I'm explaining the realistic landscape. You're threatening a 9-year-old, Ethan said. That's the realistic landscape. That's what everything you just said adds up to." Silence. "I'm not threatening anyone." "Then we don't have anything else to talk about," Ethan said. "Because the only language I'm hearing is threat." He ended the call. He sat at the table for 3 seconds. Then he called Pierce. Pierce picked up on the first ring. "The warrant," Ethan said. "Vane just told me it's being routed to a different magistrate. Someone who'll sit on it." Pierce made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "Called you directly, on my cell, which means he has resources inside the system that can pull personal contact information for civilians connected to an active investigation." That's a problem." Pierce's voice had the tight, compressed quality of a man thinking fast through an obstacle. "The magistrate routing goes through the clerk's office. If someone got to the clerk, can you go over the magistrate?" "I can go directly to the district judge." Article 3. "It bypasses the magistrate queue entirely, but I need a different threshold of documented exigency." What does that mean in plain language? It means I need to demonstrate immediate risk of evidence destruction. Right now it's a strong inference based on the drive contents. I need something more direct. Vane told me the containers are being relabeled and redistributed tonight. That's direct. He told you that on a call I don't have recorded. Ethan thought for 2 seconds, but he told me on a call that went through my carrier's network. And I've been on the phone with you for, he checked the time, 40 seconds, which means the prior call is still in the recent log. Get me the call time, the incoming number, and don't touch the phone. VoIP relay, same as the analyst's 2 a.m. call. You'll have to unpeel it. If both calls route through the same relay structure, that's a documented connection between the analyst and Vane's operation. Which is your exigency? Which might be my exigency. A pause. Cross. Are you somewhere safe? Ethan looked at the window. At the gray Accord 2 houses down. There's a vehicle I don't recognize outside. Description. He gave it. Stay inside. I'm going to have a patrol car do a pass in 8 minutes. Ethan said. What? A patrol car does a pass. They know I made you. They move faster. Let it sit. The car's probably just watching if they wanted to move on me here. They'd have done it differently. Pierce was quiet for a moment. You're telling me how to run my operation. I'm telling you what I'd do if the positions were reversed. Which is what? Watch the watcher. Don't spook them. And move on the warrant before they figure out you're moving. A longer pause. You spent how many years in reconnaissance? Pierce said. Long enough. Go somewhere that isn't your front window, Pierce said. And answer when I call. Pierce called back at 10:20 a.m. I've got a judge, he said. She's reviewing the application right now. Call log's yours, and the analysts both route through the same VoIP infrastructure. Different relay nodes, but same backbone provider. Our tech team found it in 40 minutes. The analyst, he's been removed from the case, and he's currently in a room with our internal affairs unit, talking. He's doing the thing where he asks for a lawyer, and then says things anyway. Yes, slowly. Pierce exhaled. He says he was contacted 3 weeks ago. Before last night. He was told to flag any investigation touching North Star Freight and report upward through a number he was given. They recruited him before the drive even surfaced. They knew Claire was building something. They didn't know how far along she was. How'd they get to him? Money, Pierce said, with the flatness of someone who'd been in federal law enforcement long enough for that answer to have stopped surprising him and started just being tired. His wife has medical debt. Substantial. Someone offered to make it go away. Ethan thought about Garrett in the alley. The prepared package on Lily. The fact that none of this was improvised, not the 3 men, the SUV, the analyst, the magistrate routing. It had all been in place. Claire getting close to the drive's completion had been the trigger, not the cause. Deep does it go, he said. That I don't know yet. Pierce's voice was careful now. Careful in a way that had a specific texture, the carefulness of someone who was looking at something larger than they'd anticipated and was choosing words around it. What Vane told you this morning, about sanction, about awareness at certain levels. I believe him, Pierce said. Partially. Not that it was formally sanctioned, but that someone with institutional standing was aware of it and chose not to act. Which in some ways is worse, because it means the rod is inside. It means the rod is inside, Pierce confirmed, which means when I move on this warrant, I need it to be airtight. I need the chain of evidence to be bulletproof, and I need Claire and Soren physically secure, and I need the documentation to have already been transmitted to 3 separate federal repositories before anyone who might want to suppress it knows the warrant's been signed. Can you do that? I'm doing it now. I've got 2 people uploading the drive contents to a secure federal archive system while we're talking. It'll be in 3 locations simultaneously within the hour. And the containers. If the judge signs by noon, we move by 2. Ethan looked at the clock on the kitchen wall. 10:22. 90 minutes. 90 minutes, Pierce said. Go make lunch or something. He didn't make lunch. He sat at the kitchen table and pulled up everything he could find on Redline Meridian LLCC and Westbridge International and the D.C. law firm that connected them, which wasn't much, because people who are careful about structures are careful about what surfaces publicly, enough to build a rough topography of the thing. What it looked like when he laid all of it out was a spoke and hub arrangement. Westbridge had been the early prototype, a logistics company that ran a secondary operation inside a legitimate one. When the 2006 de-investigation threatened it, the structure dissolved. But the people who'd built it didn't dissolve. They'd let it go quiet for a few years, and then they'd start it again, smarter, using Vane as the insulating layer, and Northstar as the vehicle, and Redline as the financial endpoint. 4 years operational, 7 states. The containers weren't moving drugs. Payment structure didn't match drug logistics, the margins were wrong, and the security protocols around specific shipments pointed to something with a controlled market value considerably higher per unit. Military-grade Garrett had implied in the alley. The kind of material that moved through commercial shipping only when someone with port authority access was being paid to not look. He thought about David Reyes driving off the Burnside Bridge. 34 years old, supply chain compliance, found something he shouldn't have. Told 2 people. Both of those people were presumably still alive, which meant they'd been warned rather than removed. Reyes had been different. Reyes had been further along or less manageable, or both. Ethan put that information in the same place he'd been putting everything that made him want to not be sitting in his kitchen, in the operational box, where it became data rather than where it became something to be used rather than something to carry. Stayed there for about 4 minutes. Then it came back out. Because David Reyes was 34 years old, and he'd found something in a spreadsheet, and he was dead. And the people who were responsible for that were spending this Tuesday morning routing warrant applications through sympathetic magistrates, and relabeling containers, and calling former Navy SILMs on their personal cell phones to explain why the adults in the room had everything under control. Ethan closed his laptop. He went to the garage and found the box on the top shelf above the water heater that he hadn't opened in 14 months. Inside it was a lockbox. Inside the lockbox, wrapped in a cloth that had gotten stiff with age, was his personal sidearm, a Glock 19, which he owned legally, maintained properly, and had not touched since the last time he'd cleaned it. He sat on the garage floor with his back against the wall and held the Glock in both hands, and he looked at it. He was not going to the port. That was Pierce's operation. That was federal. He was a civilian with a security license and a dog, and no standing whatsoever to participate in a federal warrant execution. Put the Glock back in the cloth. Put the cloth back in the lockbox. The lockbox back in the box. He stayed sitting on the garage floor. Ranger came in from the house and sat beside him, and they stayed like that for a while, the 2 of them in the particular quiet of a garage on a Tuesday morning with the distant sounds of the neighborhood outside. His phone rang at 11:47. Pierce. She signed it, Pierce said. Ethan exhaled. Cross. Yeah. I need you to do one thing. You said I wasn't part of this. This is separate. Pierce paused. Vane called you this morning. Which means he's identified you as a variable. Which means at some point today, someone is going to try to use you as leverage. Obvious version of that is Lily, Ethan said. She's at school. I've already called the district. There are 2 plainclothes officers on campus. The relief that moved through Ethan's body was so physical it was almost like nausea. He put one hand flat on the garage floor to steady himself. You did that already, he said. I did that at 7:40 this morning, when you told me she was at school, Pierce said. I wasn't going to mention it, unless I needed to. Ethan didn't say anything for a moment. Thank you, he finally said. Came out rougher than he intended. Don't thank me. Answer the phone if I call from the port. A pause. And stay out of the port. I will. I mean it. At 1:15 p.m., Ethan's phone showed a text from a number he didn't recognize. Words. Just an address in the warehouse district, half a mile from the port. 60 seconds later, a second text from the same number. I know where you live. Where she goes to school. Come alone or this gets worse for everyone. Ethan looked at the texts for a long time. He called Pierce. Answer. Pierce was moving, executing the warrant, exactly where he needed to be. He texted the address to Pierce with 3 words. They moved on me. Then he sat and thought about what to do. The address was a setup. He knew that. The texts were designed to look like a credible threat against Lily, calibrated to make him abandon rational judgment and walk into a controlled space at a time of their choosing. It was basic. It was the kind of play you made when your primary operations were collapsing and you needed a distraction or a bargaining chip or both. The fact that it was obvious didn't make it not work. Because Lily was 9 years old, and there were 2 plainclothes officers at her school, and he'd been told she was safe, and he believed it, and it didn't matter. It didn't change the frequency his nervous system was running at. He looked at Ranger. The dog looked back at him. "Okay," Ethan said. He drove to the address. It was a commercial storage facility on the edge of the warehouse district, the kind that rented units to small businesses and contractors. Roll-up metal doors, a chain-link perimeter, a management office that was closed on Tuesdays. The lot was empty. Ethan parked on the street outside the perimeter and sat in the truck for 2 minutes, scanning. One vehicle in the lot, not a Suburban. A plain white cargo van backed into a space near the far unit. Visible occupants, but the engine was warm. He could see the heat distortion above the exhaust. One point of entry through the chain-link gate, which was open. Building to the left offered a corner position, with sightlines to both the gate and the van. He did a slow, methodical assessment of the lot. Windows in the office building, too. Loading dock on the east side, one truck could access. Storage units themselves were individual roll-up doors, locked from outside, which meant anyone inside a unit couldn't get out without help. Ranger was in the cab beside him, watching through the windshield with the same focused attention he'd had in the alley. Ethan's phone rang. Unknown number again. Eucane said, a voice he didn't recognize. "Garrett." "No, Vane." "Younger, park inside the gate." Ethan said. A pause. "You're going to want to cooperate. Tell me what you want." Pierce called off the port operation. "You're going to confirm that with him right now and play it to me on speaker." Pierce didn't call anything off. He's going to. "He executed the warrant 45 minutes ago," Ethan said. "Containers are open. Whatever was in them is already being documented by a federal evidence team." This is over. Dead silence on the line. The silence lasted long enough to tell Ethan something. Person on the other end hadn't known. They'd been sent to this location, given a script and an objective, without current intelligence on the port operation. They were a field element operating on instructions that were already outdated by the time they received them. That meant they were not coordinating in real time with whoever was running this, which meant they were exposed. "You don't know what happened at the port," Ethan said. "Whoever sent you here didn't tell you because they found out after you were already deployed." He looked at the van. "You're running a play for a hand that already lost." More silence. Then the van's engine turned over. Ethan stepped out of the truck and held his position at the gate and watched the van pull out of the space and drive to the far exit at the back of the lot. It didn't accelerate hard. It just left deliberately the way a contractor leaves when the contract has been voided. Professional, uninvested, already moving on. He stood at the gate until it was gone. Then he called Pierce again. This time Pierce picked up. Background noise, voices, radio traffic, the unmistakable sound of a large space being worked. "We're at the port," Pierce said, and his voice had a different quality now. Tight, compressed tension of the morning. Something harder and more settled. The specific quality of a man who had found what he came for. "Cross, there's 6 containers. 6. We've got 3 open so far, and I need you to understand that what's inside them is..." He paused, choosing the word carefully. "Significant." "How significant?" "Enough that I've already made 3 calls I've never made in my career before today, and I'm about to make a 4th. A brief pause. "Military hardware. Not surplus, not modified, commercial. Serialized, current generation, and some of it is still in manufacturer packaging." Ethan leaned against the truck and closed his eyes for a second. "Vane," he said. "We picked him up at his estate 40 minutes ago. His lawyers were there in 25 minutes, which tells you something about how prepared they were for this possibility." Pierce's voice remained level. "He's not talking, But his lawyers are very carefully not saying certain things, which is almost as informative. Garrett, working on it. The name and description you gave us. We've got a partial match to a known alias attached to a private military contracting entity out of Virginia. Same state as Westbridge. Same circle, Ethan said. Same circle, Pierce said. This goes deeper than North Star Cross. What we found today, this is going to have a shelf life measured in months, not weeks. There are people above Vane who are going to have to answer for this, and they are not going to go quietly. Ethan said, "You need to know something else." Pierce lowered his voice slightly, as if moving away from other people. The analyst on my team, the one who made the 2 a.m. call. Before A got through to him, he said one thing unprompted. He said they'd told him that you, specifically you, Ethan Cross, were the biggest risk to the operation. More than the drive, more than Claire, because you were outside any system they could predict or control. Ethan thought about that. He's not wrong, Pierce said. They sent 8 men last night for a hard drive. They sent Garrett to negotiate. They had Vane call you personally. He paused. A man in a second-hand jacket on a park bench. That's what they were afraid of. The storage facility lot was empty and quiet. The mid-afternoon light had come through the clouds and was sitting on the chain link and the empty spaces between the units. And somewhere intervened, and somewhere a few blocks north, the federal evidence team was photographing the inside of 6 containers while Pierce coordinated on a radio. And somewhere east of that, Claire Bennett was in a federal building, drinking coffee she didn't really want and answering questions for the 4th hour in a row. "How's Claire?" Ethan said. "Tired," Pierce said. "Good tired, though. Kind where you're tired, because something is finally over instead of because it's not." "And Soren?" "Same. She keeps asking if she can go home." "Keep telling her soon." "Tell her soon," Ethan said. A brief pause. "Cross. Go home." "Yeah," Ethan said. "I mean it this time." "I know." He got in the truck. Ranger took the passenger seat and put his nose against the window glass, leaving a smear. Ethan sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel and looked at the empty lot and the sky above it and the way the light was sitting on everything, ordinary and unaware, the way light always is. His arm had stiffened completely. His knee would need ice. He had a security shift at the concert venue on Friday that he was now going to be too visible to work, which was a conversation he was going to have with his supervisor that he was not looking forward to. Thought about calling Lily's school. Thought about doing it, and then decided Pierce had already covered it, and that calling would be the kind of thing you did when you needed to hear something, rather than when the something was actually in doubt. He'd wait. He'd pick her up at 3:30 like always, and she'd tell him about whatever the art class had done today, and Ranger would press his head against her, and she'd tell the dog about it too, in a different voice, higher and easier, way she talked to him when she thought no one was listening. Started the truck. He drove home through the washed, clean Portland streets and the thin October light and the city going about its Tuesday in the complete unawareness of everything that had happened in it since 9:47 the previous night. And he thought about Vane sitting in a room with his lawyers saying nothing, and Garrett somewhere still running, and the 6 containers at the port, and Claire's 93 days, and David Reyes, who'd found the corner first and hadn't had someone standing at the alley entrance when the 3 men came. He thought about Pierce's voice, saying that's what they were afraid of. A man in a second-hand jacket on a park bench. Not a hero. A weapon. Not even someone who'd been looking for trouble. Just a man who'd been sitting outside a closed coffee shop in the rain when the dog's ears went forward. Pulled into his driveway. He sat in the truck. After a while, he went inside and made coffee he probably didn't need, and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the maple tree in the backyard until the clock said 3:15, and it was time to go get his daughter. Was the last one out. She always was. She had a habit of staying to help the teacher stack chairs or collect stray pencils from under desks, a habit that nobody had taught her and that she'd never mentioned. Ethan had simply noticed over 2 years of 30 pickups. came through the school's main door with her backpack hanging off one shoulder and her jacket half unzipped and something drawn in marker on the back of her left hand, a shape he couldn't identify from. 15 feet away, an animal or a map or maybe both. She saw him and didn't wave, just walked toward him with the specific unhurried confidence of a kid who knows exactly where she's going. Ranger was out of the truck before Ethan had fully opened the door, crossing the pickup lane at a trot, and Lily crouched and got both arms around the dog's neck and said something directly into his ear that Ethan couldn't hear. Ranger's tail moved in the slow wide arc that he reserved for exactly 2 people in the world. "You look worse than this morning," Lily said, standing up. "Thank you. What happened to your arm?" "Bumped it." She looked at the tear in the jacket sleeve, at the bruise visible at the edge of the cuff. She was 9 years old, and she had her mother's capacity for seeing through inadequate explanations, which was a quality Ethan simultaneously admired and found exhausting. "Okay," she said. She didn't press it. She got in the truck. Yes, he'd intervened. They drove home through the afternoon traffic, and she told him about the art class they were doing printmaking, she said, which involved carving into a soft block and then rolling ink over it and pressing paper against it. And the thing on her hand was ink from where she'd accidentally touched the block before it was finished. The shape was supposed to be a crow. "Is it a crow?" Ethan said. She looked at her hand critically. "It's more like a potato with wings right now. But I'm going to fix it tomorrow." "Good plan." She was quiet for a block. "Were you scared last night?" Ethan kept his eyes on the road. He said, "But you did it anyway." "Yeah." She nodded, like that confirmed something she'd already decided. She looked out her window at the passing city, and then she said, very casually, the way she said things that she'd been thinking about for a long time, but had chosen to deliver lightly, "I think that's what brave is. When you're not scared. Just when you do it anyway." Ethan didn't say anything. She put her marker-stained hand on Ranger's back and left it there the rest of the way home. Pierce called at 6 p.m. Ethan was at the kitchen stove doing something approximate with chicken and rice, while Lily sat at the table doing homework, which she was supposed to be doing quietly, but was in fact doing, while also explaining to Ranger in detail the plot of a book she'd read at school. Ranger was listening with the committed attention he gave all of her monologues. Ethan stepped into the hallway. "All 6 containers documented," Pierce said. 41 individual items. "I'm not going to tell you what they are over the phone, but the short version is that what we found would have significantly changed the balance of capability for whoever the end recipients were." "Recipients in what country?" "That question is above my clearance level right now, which tells you everything about how far up this goes." A pause. Vane is still not talking. His lawyers filed 3 motions before dinner. None of them are going to stick, but they bought him overnight. Garrett, still running. "We have a name the alias traces to a man named Carver Mast, former DU'd contractor, worked private military advisory for about 8 years after that. He's in the system but off the grid currently. He'll surface," Ethan said. "People like that always do." Pierce paused. "Connection you found this morning. Westbridge to Redline through the law firm. Our financial crimes unit has been working it all day. There are 4 additional individuals connected to both structures across the 15-year timeline. 2 of them are currently employed in federal advisory roles." Ethan leaned against the hallway wall. "That's what Vane meant," he said. "Sanctioned." "It wasn't sanctioned," Pierce said, with a flatness that had conviction in it. "Tolerated by people who should have stopped it and didn't, which is different. And I promise you, they're going to spend a significant amount of time explaining that difference in front of people who are not going to find it persuasive." He exhaled. "This is going to be a long one, Cross. This doesn't wrap up in a week or a month." Yes, he'd intervened. There are going to be hearings and motions and appeals and moments when it looks like it's stalling, and it's going to ask a lot of the people who put it in motion. She's going to be a central witness. Soren, too. Their credibility, methodology, yes, their documentation, all of it is going to be challenged, repeatedly, yet by people with very good lawyers and very deep pockets. "Will it hold?" "The evidence is solid," Pierce said. "Claire built it right. 93 days of clean, documented, methodical work. If she can hold up under cross-examination, she held up in an alley with a baton pointed at her face, Ethan said. She'll hold up in a courtroom. A pause. Yeah, Pierce said. I think she will too. And David Reyes. The Burnside Bridge case has been referred to the homicide unit as of this afternoon. It's active now. I can't tell you how it ends, but I can tell you it's no longer closed. Ethan looked at the ceiling of his hallway, at the water stain in the corner from the leak they'd had in January, that he'd fixed but hadn't repainted over. Okay, he said. One more thing. Pierce's voice changed slightly. Softer. Pierce didn't really do soft, but something in it adjusted toward something that wasn't purely professional. I'm going to need a formal statement from you. Everything from last night and this morning. On record. When Thursday. My office. Bring the dog if you want, I don't care. Okay. And cross. A pause. What you did last night, staying with her, making the call, holding that position without backup. I want you to know that I know what that cost you. Professionally, I mean. Your statement is going to be in a federal record now. Your name is going to be attached to a case of this scale. People are going to know you exist in a way they didn't before. You're all right with that? Ethan thought about it. Actually thought about it, standing in his hallway with the sounds of Lily's homework monologue and Ranger's patient, silence coming from the kitchen. I've been trying to be invisible for 5 years, he said. I got very good at it, and it was right for a while. It's what Lily needed. He paused, but invisible doesn't mean gone. The things I know how to do, they don't disappear, because I stopped using them. They're just waiting. Another pause, and last night someone needed me to use them. Yeah, Pierce said. That's enough for now. Good enough for me, Pierce said. Thursday, 10 a.m. 3 days later, Ethan sat across a table from Claire Bennett in a corner of the federal building cafeteria that was empty at 2 in the afternoon. She had a coffee, and he had a coffee, and Ranger was under the table being technically against the building's dog policy, which Pierce had waved through without a word. Claire looked different in daylight. Older in some ways, younger in others, the specific rearrangement that happens to a person's face when a long-term weight has been removed. She was still careful, still precise, still had that quality of watching everything from a slight analytical distance. The layer of braced tension that had been running under all of it, the night in the alley, was gone. All the way, it would probably never be entirely gone, for either of them, but down to something manageable. How are you? Ethan said. Tired. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. My boss called yesterday. He wanted to know if I was planning to return to work, which I think was his way of asking if the job still exists, which it does. I checked. She looked at the cup. Took 2 days of personal leave. I've been sleeping. That's good. I don't usually sleep more than 6 hours. I slept 11 hours on Wednesday. She looked up. I think my body knew something my brain was still catching up on. Ethan nodded. Pierce told me about your statement, she said. That you're on record. Yeah. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to pull you into something that... You didn't pull me into anything, Ethan said. I walked into an alley. You walked into an alley because 3 men Vaughn were following me. I walked into an alley because it was the right thing to do. He said it without emphasis, the way you state coordinates. Those aren't the same thing as being pulled. She looked at him for a moment with the evaluating expression. He was getting familiar with the forensic accountant's habit of assessing the accuracy of a statement before accepting it. Okay, she said. Thank you then. You don't have to thank me. I don't have to. She picked up her coffee. I want to. There's a difference. He almost smiled. Ranger shifted under the table and put his chin on Claire's wheel. She looked down at him, surprised, then put one hand on his head. He did that in the alley, she said. After everything. He just came and put his head in my lap. He makes decisions about people, Ethan said. Once he's made them, he doesn't reconsider. Smart dog. Smarter than most people I know. That's a very low bar depending on the people. Smile this time. She did too, briefly, and then she looked down at Ranger again, and the expression that moved across her face wasn't quite sadness, but was in the neighborhood. David Reyes, she said quietly. I heard the case is active. His family reached out to me yesterday, his sister. She was quiet for a moment. She wanted to know if I thought it would go anywhere. What did you tell her? I told her the truth, that it might and it might not. That the evidence is real and the people looking at it are serious, but that the world doesn't always cooperate with what's real and serious. She pressed her lips together. She said that was more honest than anything anyone had told her in 2 years. It was the right thing to say. I don't know if it helped. Probably not, Ethan said, but it was still right. She looked at him. You believe that? That being right matters even when it doesn't help? Ethan thought about the alley, about Ranger's ears, about the choice he'd made, not dramatically, with any particular sense of destiny. Just practically, the way you make a choice when it's the only one you can make and still be who you are. I believe it enough, he said. Most days, that's also honest. I try. She set her coffee down. She looked at the table and then at him and then at something past him that wasn't in the room. I've been doing this work for 11 years, she said. Financial forensics. The work is slow and quiet, and most of the time the thing you find is smaller than you expected, and the people responsible face consequences that don't match the damage. I've had cases go cold. I've had evidence ruled inadmissible. I've watched things I spent years building dissolve in appellate motions. She paused. This is the biggest thing I've ever found, and I still don't know how it ends. Does yet. No, she looked at him. But it's moving. It's actually moving. And the reason it's moving is because the evidence exists and is in the right hands and can't be made to disappear. Because you built it right. Because I built it right, she said. And because someone made sure I got out of that alley, with it still in my hands. Ethan said nothing. I'm not going to let it go quiet, she said. Whatever the next 2 years looks like, the hearings, the motions, the cross-examinations, I'm not going to let them make it go quiet. I know, he said. How do you know? Because you had a baton under your chin and you still wouldn't hand over the bag. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the bag was my laptop charger and a library book. I'd already moved the drive to my jacket pocket. Ethan stared at her. She held his gaze with an expression that was perfectly composed. Before I left my apartment, she said, I moved it. In case they got the bag. He thought about that. About all 4 armed men from the SUV converging on that leather bag in the alcove. About Garrett's whole operational focus trained on an object that had been empty of its actual contents the entire time. The bag was a decoy, he said. The bag was a library book and a charger, she said. But yes, he looked at her for a long moment. Then he shook his head slowly. You're something else, he said. She picked up her coffee. I've been in this field for 11 years. You learn to think ahead. He gave his statement on Thursday, as agreed. 3 hours. Recorded. 2 federal attorneys in the room plus Pierce. Yes, he'd intervened, going through the events of Tuesday night in sequential order with a particular methodical patience of people who needed everything in the right place for what came after. He was precise. He was complete. He named everything he'd observed, every decision he'd made, every assessment that had led to each action. It was not unlike a post-operation debrief, except that the setting was a federal building in Portland, and the stakes were legal rather than tactical, and nobody was offering him a bad cup of coffee in a forward-operating base somewhere without a name. It was done. When it was done, one of the federal attorneys looked at his notes, and then at Ethan and said, unkindly, Mr. Cross, your tactical assessment of the threat situation was very detailed. I had good training, Ethan said. Clearly. He paused. Have you considered returning to... No, Ethan said. The attorney nodded, accepting this. Pierce walked him out to the lobby afterward. They stood near the main doors for a moment with the afternoon light coming through the glass and Ranger sitting patiently beside Ethan's knee. Asked, Ethan said. Garrett, not yet, but we're closer. He moved twice since Tuesdays weren't triangulating through the contractor network. He'll surface. He'll try again, Ethan said. Not on the case. Case is too far along. But on something. People like that don't stop. Pierce said. When he does, I'll be there. You need anything from me before then. You'll be the first call, Pierce said. He paused. Go home. You keep saying that. You keep standing here. He extended his hand. Ethan shook it. 2 weeks later, Marcus Vane was formally indicted on 11 federal counts, including arms trafficking, conspiracy to commit fraud against the United States, obstruction of justice. His lawyers released a statement characterizing the charges as politically motivated and factually unsupported. The statement did not address the 41 documented items found in 6 containers at the Port of Portland. 3 of the 4 individuals connected to both Westbridge International and Red Line Meridian were placed on administrative leave from the federal advisory positions pending investigation. The 4th had already retained counsel and declined to comment. A homicide investigation into David Reyes's death produced, within its first week, a phone record showing contact between Reyes and a number associated with North Star's secondary operations structure in the 72 hours before he went off the Burnside Bridge. It was not conclusive. It was enough to keep the case open and moving. Carver Mast Garrett was located in late November outside Portland in a short-term rental in Beaverton. He was taken into federal custody without incident, which was either a testament to Pierce's team's preparation or to masked professionalism or both. His arraignment produced a list of charges that ran to 4 pages. He declined to enter a plea on the first day. His attorney requested a 3-week extension before the next hearing. Of this resolved quickly. None of it was clean. The legal architecture of a case this size moved at a pace that had nothing to do with the urgency of the people inside it, and there were weeks when the machinery seemed to stall. When motions piled on motions, and the distance between what had happened and what the system was prepared to do about it felt enormous and cold. Claire testified 3 times in the 6 months that followed. Each time she came in with her documentation organized, and her methodology airtight, and her voice steady, and each time the opposing counsel worked through every available angle to find a crack in the foundation she'd built, and each time found the foundation as solid as it had been the time before. Called Ethan after the 3rd session, not to report, just to talk, for 10 minutes, about nothing in particular. The way you call someone who was in the same room when something important happened, because they're the one who understands what the room felt like. He answered every time. In January, on a Saturday morning when the Portland rain had briefly relented and the sky had gone to a thin, clear blue that never lasted long but was beautiful, precisely because it didn't, Ethan took Lily and Ranger to Waterfront Park. Lily was working on a new printmaking project, birds this time, multiple species, which required research, which had led to a sustained and encyclopedic interest in Pacific Northwest birds that had taken over approximately 40% of her conversation for the past 2 weeks. She had a small notebook, and she was recording every bird she saw, with a rough sketch beside each name, and she moved along the river path ahead of Ethan at the specific pace of a child who is simultaneously walking and looking at everything, which was slower than walking, but faster than standing still. Ranger walked beside her, off-leash. He stayed within 6 feet of her without being told. Ethan walked behind them both, his hands in his jacket pockets, watching the river. The Willamette was high from the winter rains, brown-green and moving, carrying small debris from somewhere upstream. Thought about the 5 years since he'd left the teams. Security shifts and the gas station coffee, and the 3:30 pickups, and the kitchen table homework, and the way Lily's marker-stained hands left prints on the refrigerator door that he kept meaning to wipe off and kept not wiping off. He thought about Tuesday night in November, Ranger's ears going forward. The decision that wasn't really a decision, just the only thing that made sense. He thought about what Pierce had said, that the people who'd built the operation and the people who'd tolerated it were afraid of a man in a second-hand jacket on a park bench. Because of what he'd done, because of what he might do, because of what it meant that someone like him was still out there, still paying attention, still capable of walking into an alley and making a call and holding a position without anyone having asked him to. He thought about that for a while. Then Lily stopped ahead of him and pointed at something on the riverbank, a great blue heron, No, standing in the shallows with the absolute stillness of a creature that had learned that patience was a form of power. She was already drawing it in her notebook, her head bent over the page, not speaking. Ranger sat beside her and watched the bird. Ethan stopped and watched them both. The heron stood in the water without moving. The river moved around it. The thin winter light came down on all of it and held. Spent 5 years trying to be invisible, to take up less space, to be the background, the ordinary man, the tired father, with the second-hand jacket and the security job. There was nothing wrong with that. It had been right. For the season, it was right for. It had given Lily stability and Ranger a home, and himself something that felt most days like enough. But invisible and gone were not the same thing. He'd understood that on a fire escape in a Portland alley at 11 p.m. in the rain, watching 4 armed men block the exit, with a woman who wouldn't let go of her bag, and a dog who wouldn't move from her side, and a phone in his hand with one number he hadn't called in 14 months. He hadn't hesitated, not because he wasn't afraid. He'd been afraid not of the men, exactly, of what happened if he miscalculated, of what it would mean for the 9-year-old asleep in the house on the east side if he was wrong about any of it. That fear had been real and specific, and he'd carried it through the whole night like a stone in his pocket. He'd done it anyway. The morning after that, and all the mornings that had followed, he'd woken up and made coffee and packed lunches and done the ordinary relentless work of being a father. Work had not diminished for what had happened, had not been made smaller or less important. If anything, it had clarified, the way things clarify when you've been reminded of what you're protecting and why. He was still a father. He was still a protector. Those were not separate things. They had never been separate things. He'd just spent 5 years trying to convince himself they were because it was easier than accepting that both were true simultaneously. Yes, he'd intervened that a man could be entirely devoted to a 9-year-old's art projects and library books and still be the person who stepped forward when someone needed stepping forward. The heron moved, one slow, precise extension of its neck, and then it was still again. Lily looked up from her notebook and looked at Ethan. "Did you see it?" she said. "Yeah," he said. "I saw it." She turned back to her drawing. Ranger's tail moved once. The river ran on beside them in the thin winter light. And the city went on doing what cities do, traffic and voices, and the low continuous hum of 1 million people going about their days, in the ordinary complicated work of being alive. And Ethan stood there on the riverbank, with his hands in his pockets and his dog and his daughter, and felt, for the first time in a long time, exactly like himself. The himself he'd been before. Not the SEAL, not the operator, not the man who'd moved through places that didn't exist on civilian maps. Not only the exhausted single father either, trying to be small enough to not be noticed. The full complicated both of it. He could live with that. He could do more than live with it. Sometimes the people who carry the most are the ones who never ask to be seen, and the most dangerous thing in the world isn't a man with a weapon. It's a quiet man who knows exactly who he is and what he's willing to do to protect the people standing beside him.